sincerely hope that mine is just one of many portraits of prime ministers from both parties that will continue to be hung here for decades and centuries to come. But that will require that in these perilous times, both parties, whatever their other differences, come together against external forces that threaten our independence and against domestic policies that threaten our unity. We must preserve Canada, this country handed down to us by Providence, preserved by our ancestors, and held in trust for our descendants. We must make any sacrifice necessary to preserve the independence and the unity of this blessed land.
The concluding note there from former Prime Minister Stephen Harper at the unveiling of his portrait. He delivered about a 25-30-minute speech. We heard from Prime Minister Mark Carney before him. A whole bunch of prominent Conservatives, past, present, future, were in that room. 3 of them are now in this room to talk about the speech and the legacy Mr. Harper leaves behind. This week, of course, is 20 years, marks 20 years since Stephen Harper became Prime Minister. Former Cabinet Ministers Peter MacKay, James Moore and Tony Clement are all in studio with us right now. Hi, great to have you here. Thanks for rushing over from the ceremony. Peter, I'll start with you, and I kind of got to start where Prime Minister Harper ended. That ending of the speech was particularly poignant, given what our country faces at this moment. What did you make of it?
Yeah, I agree, Vash. I thought it was very stirring and very Stephen Harper. Understated, but there was an element of drama in what he said that resonated, certainly not just around the room, but around the country, given some of the external threats that are happening. And it was also a speech that really covered the waterfront in many ways. It's not lost on anyone that he's an economist. The current Prime Minister is an economist, and he made some good-natured jabs with respect to a balanced budget. But overall, I think it captured the moment and was very memorable to be there. It was very great to see colleagues like James and Tony. We shared a lot of those times, a lot of those experiences. And I think Stephen Harper, will go down as one of the great prime ministers, certainly of our lifetime.
For people who are watching who aren't here in Ottawa, this week is kind of like James Harperpalooza week, right? Like there's a series of events, and it must feel, I imagine, a bit like a high school reunion or a family reunion. Yeah. If you reflect on the time the Prime Minister spent in office, what are you thinking about as you think back to what we're commemorating?
I think about a lot of things. I actually think about how improbable the rise to power that Stephen Harper accomplished was likely ever to happen. He ran for the Canadian Alliance leadership with 2 very young kids, having left his presidency of the National Citizens Coalition, and the Conservative movement was shattered. Right? The Canadian Alliance was the official opposition, but we were mired in a civil war over Stockwell Day's leadership. We were single digits in the polls nationally. The Progressive Conservatives existed under Joe Clark's leadership, and he was intransigent and didn't want to unite. We had 13, not 1 or 2, 13 members of Parliament who were sitting as independents, as former Canadian Alliance members of Parliament. And then you had the broad cross-section of Canadians who wanted an alternative, who just said, this is a mess and this is ridiculous. And then along comes Stephen Harper, wins the Alliance leadership, unites the caucus, brings the independents back, works with Peter MacKay, creates the new Conservative Party after he replaces Joe Clark. We go to Canadians, he holds the Paul Martin juggernaut to a minority, and then he wins an election in 2006. And his ability to do all of that inside of less than 3 years is one of the most remarkable political success stories of our lifetimes. And that's what we're honoring today. Is Stephen Harper the man? It's Stephen Harper the accomplishment of earning the opportunity to be the Prime Minister of the country. And it's an incredible success story.
What do you think the key to the success of those 3 years, as James lays them out, was? Like, what do you think it was about Stephen Harper that allowed for that success?
In between losing and winning the election.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of that, we saw Stephen Harper learn from the 2004 election, make some adjustments to both himself and the team, and present a winning combination, winning formula that captured enough hearts and minds of people who had reservations about Stephen Harper. Let's not forget, I remember going door to door. I don't know about that Stephen Harper. He's a pretty scary guy. Sound familiar?
Yes.
So he was able to overcome that, and then, of course, once in power, was able to assure Canadians that he was a strong leader who also was very well versed in the economy and the politics of our nation and the unity required to keep our nation together. And he demonstrated that in his almost 10 years in office.
What do you think people don't know who would just consume, what we've consumed over the last 20 years about Stephen Harper that you knew, Peter, from working with him around the cabinet table?
Well, he was, firstly, and I think people do appreciate this now more than perhaps when he was the Prime Minister, is that he's a raging pragmatist. He kept very, very focused on the fundamentals, very competent, obviously, around the economy, passionate about our military, about the Arctic. There were aspects of his pursuits where he was clearly very emotional and invested in getting results. And I think he never lost that. He never lost that focus, even under the pressures of the job, the pushing and pulling that happens naturally in politics and even around the cabinet table. And he was also wickedly prepared. He would come to cabinet, and you would have to be fully aware that he knew your file inside and out, and you had to be ready, to present. And I will say this, and I don't know if my colleagues will agree, but he would change his mind in spite of the fact that he had this sort of rigid, outward-facing personality. But if you came and made a reasoned, thoughtful presentation to him, he would agree.
It's funny because I asked Tony that earlier on the radio show. Did he do that? Was he consultative in that way? So that's interesting to hear it from both of you. The moment of this ceremony tonight was also, like, just as a Canadian watching from the outside, kind of nice to see, given everything that we are consuming south of the border. In particular, the kind words that both prime ministers had for each other. What did you make of that? How did it feel in the room, James?
I hope a lot of Canadians do take the opportunity to find the whole ceremony online and watch it. It's a good moment. Right, is that you saw the speakers of the House and Senate, the leader of the Liberal Party, the Prime Minister of the country, and the former Prime Minister, all statesmen, thoughtful, decent, credible, substantive people. And Stephen Harper, when he was Prime Minister, he made a couple of moves as well, not only policy pragmatism, but on the personnel side, right? The biggest foreign policy commitment of our lifetimes was the Afghanistan war. He reached out to John Manley and he said, work with us in the Afghanistan mission. He did a report. He wanted to have somebody who was a deal maker and who was substantive and thoughtful and had a good interpersonal skills and who was a tactical politician. So he went to New Democrat Premier Gary Doer and said, can you go to Washington for me? And in British Columbia, my home province, he thought that I wasn't ready for cabinet, and he was probably right. and he reached out to David Emerson, and he said, you're a substantive and thoughtful guy with deep business experience and government experience, and even though it's going to cause me some political headaches, I'd like you to be part of my cabinet. That's a prime minister who took some political risks and reached beyond the normal group of colleagues and said, if you can contribute to making the country better by making my government better, I want you to be part of my team. And there's risks associated with all of that. The extension of that is what you saw today, which is a prime minister, two prime ministers who have deep respect for each other, who have differences, but they respect those differences, and they want the country to do well. And it's a good Canadian moment of people who sincerely want the country to do well and are diplomatic and thoughtful about it. And the event that we saw today wouldn't happen in the United States for the past 10 years, probably won't happen in the United States for the next 10 years. And that's tragic. I hope I'm wrong, but it's happening in Canada, and I think we're lucky for that.
20 years out, last word to you, Tony. What do you think the legacy of Stephen Harper is at this moment?
Can I just mention one thing before I answer that question, which is it quite hurt not to have the late Jim Prentice and the late Jim Flaherty at that event. I remember them. We worked so closely together with those two great leaders and politicians. 20 years out, I believe that what I'm hearing from Canadians already is those were pretty good years. Looking back, people have a bit of tinge of nostalgia. That's automatic and understandable, but they're saying those were good years for Canada. We had, there were a few wrinkles in the Harper years, but those were pretty good years, and that's a good legacy for Stephen Harper.
Well, I'll leave it on that note. I really appreciate all of you making the time for the discussion and coming here in person. Thank you, Tony Clement, James Moore, and Peter MacKay.